The Duke's wild black stallion. Rejected every rider. Then it knelt before the girl everyone mocked. The horse had a name, but most people at Ashwood Manor preferred not to use it. They called him that animal, or the black one, or simply the problem. His real name was Erebus, and he had arrived at the estate on a cold October morning, shipped from the south of France in a wooden crate that he had already half destroyed by the time the cart reached the front gate. He was enormous. Jet black from the tip of his nose to the last hair of his tail, with eyes the color of deep water and a chest broad enough to make grown men step back instinctively when he turned toward them. The Duke of Ashford had paid a great deal of money for Erebus, and he had expected to be proud of that decision. He was not. In the 6 months since the horse had arrived, 3 trained riders had been thrown. One had broken his arm. Another had sprained both wrists catching himself on the paddock fence. The third, a celebrated trainer brought down from London at considerable expense, had simply walked to the stable door after 15 minutes, handed back the lead rope without a word, and asked for his carriage to be brought around. He did not send a bill. He also did not leave a note explaining what he had found inside that stall. He simply left, and the silence he left behind was louder than anything he could have said. The Duke had called a meeting of his senior staff 3 weeks ago. He sat at the head of the dining table with the estate manager on his left and Thomas Holt, the head groom, on his right. The conclusion of that meeting was brief and unpleasant. Erebus would be sold at the autumn auction. A buyer had already expressed interest, a man from the north with a reputation for working difficult horses into submission. No one at the table felt entirely comfortable with this, but no one said so out loud. The auction was set for the first Monday of November. That gave them 22 days. Clara Voss did not attend that meeting. She was not the sort of person who attended meetings at Ashwood Manor. She was 16 years old, the daughter of the laundress, and she had grown up on the edges of the estate the way a plant grows on the edge of a wall, quietly, in whatever light was available, without anyone particularly noticing. She had a stammer that appeared without warning when she was nervous, swallowing her words before she could get them out. She wore clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric was difficult to identify. She was not pretty in the way that got noticed, and she was not loud in the way that got remembered. The stable boys called her Mouse when they called her anything at all. She had grown up on the edges of the estate the way a plant grows on the edge of a wall, quietly, in whatever light was available, without anyone particularly noticing. But every evening, when the dinner bell rang and the grooms filed into the servants' hall, Clara went to the stables. She did not go inside. She sat on an overturned bucket outside Erebus's stall and she talked to him. Not about anything important, about the color of the sky that afternoon, about a robin she had seen in the kitchen garden, about a sentence she had read in a book she had quietly borrowed from the manor library. She talked in the low, unhurried voice of someone who is not expecting an answer and is therefore not disappointed when one does not come. The first evening, Erebus stood at the back of his stall with his ears flat and his nostrils wide. He watched her the way a wild thing watches something it has not yet categorized as safe or dangerous. The second evening, he moved closer to the door. By the 5th evening, he was standing at the door entirely, his great dark head hanging over the top rail, watching her with an expression that was not quite calm but was not quite fury either. It was something in between, something that looked, if you watched it carefully enough, remarkably like curiosity. On the 7th evening, Clara held out a wild apple she had picked from the old tree near the orchard wall. She did not reach toward him. She simply opened her palm and waited. Erebus looked at the apple for a long time. Then he leaned forward and took it from her hand. She was not coming to take anything from him. She was simply coming to sit nearby, the way you sit near someone who is grieving, not to fix it, but so they know they are not alone. She did not make a sound. She did not reach up to touch him or pull back in surprise or call out to anyone. She simply sat still while he ate, and when he was finished she said, very quietly, "Good evening," and went home. Thomas Holt found her there 9 days later. He came around the corner of the stable block carrying a lantern and stopped so abruptly that the light swung and threw wild shadows across the yard. Clara was sitting on her bucket. Erebus's nose was an inch from her shoulder. What Holt said to her was not kind. He told her she was trespassing near the Duke's property. He told her that a horse like Erebus was not a pet and not a toy and not something a girl with no training had any business being near. He told her that if she was found here again, her mother's position at the manor would be reviewed. The stable boys who had followed him around the corner laughed at this last part. Clara stood up. Her face was red and her hands were pressed flat against her sides, and for a moment the stammer rose in her throat and she could not say a word. Then she nodded once, picked up her bucket, and walked away. She came back the following evening. She did not do it to be defiant. She came back because Erebus was going to be sold in 13 days to a man whose methods she did not want to think about, and she was the only person at Ashwood Manor who had noticed that the horse was not wicked. He was afraid. He had been handled by people who wanted something from him every single time they came near him, and he had learned, as afraid things do, to treat every approach as a threat. She was not coming to take anything from him. She was simply coming to sit nearby, the way you sit near someone who is grieving, not to fix it, but so they know they are not alone. She began going inside the stall on the 12th night. She did not rush it. She opened the latch slowly, stepped in, and moved to the far corner, her back against the wall. Erebus turned to face her. The stall was not large, and he was very big, and the air between them was very still. She started talking, about the frost on the grass that morning, about a letter her mother had received from a cousin in Bristol, about the way the sky had turned 3 different colors of pink at sunset. She stayed for 2 hours. When she left, Erebus was standing with his head lowered and his eyes half closed, not asleep, but something close to rested. Lady Seraphine, the Duke's daughter, had been watching from the garden wall for the better part of a week. She was 19, well-read, and considerably more observant than people gave her credit for. She had said nothing to anyone because she was not entirely sure what she was seeing. She only knew that the most difficult horse in Devonshire was now, apparently, allowing a laundress's daughter to stand in his stall in the dark and tell him about pink sunsets. She told her father on a Thursday evening, over supper, in the careful tone she used when she wanted him to listen without becoming immediately dismissive. The Duke said nothing. He folded his napkin, pushed back his chair, and went to the stables the following evening. She had watched Erebus from the first week he arrived, and she had seen that every person who came near him came with something they wanted, and that the horse had never, in his life, had anyone come near him with nothing to take at all. He climbed to the hayloft and watched through the slats in the wood. He watched Clara move around the stall without hurry, without fear, without any of the stiff, cautious performance he had seen from every professional who had entered that space before her. He watched Erebus follow her, not because she was pulling him or directing him, but because the horse had simply decided, on his own, to be wherever she was. The Duke watched for 40 minutes. Then he climbed down from the hayloft and went back to the house and sat in his study for a long time without lighting the lamp. The morning of the 17th day arrived cold and bright, with a hard frost on the paddock grass and a thin skin of ice on the water troughs. Clara was crossing the yard with a bundle of clean linen when Thomas Holt stepped out of the stable door and addressed her in a voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He said what he had said before, but louder this time, and with more witnesses. He said she was embarrassing herself. He said the horse would never be ridden by anyone, let alone by a girl who could not get through a sentence without losing the words halfway. He said she should understand her place and stay in it. The yard was quiet. A footman had stopped walking. 2 grooms leaned against the fence, watching. Clara stood in the middle of it all with the linen bundle pressed against her chest and her face completely still. Then she set the bundle on the ground. She walked to the paddock gate, unlatched it, and stepped through. She walked to the center of the open grass and stood there. Then she turned toward the stable and called Erebus by name, once, in a clear voice that did not shake at all. The horse had not been wicked. He had been waiting. And the girl that everyone had overlooked had simply been the first person willing to sit still long enough to find that out. For a moment, nothing happened. Then there was a sound from inside the stable, a slow, heavy movement, and Erebus came through the open door at a walk. Not a nervous walk. Not the stiff, high-headed walk of a horse looking for something to bolt from. A slow, deliberate, considered walk, the walk of an animal who had decided to go somewhere and was going there. He crossed the paddock. He stopped in front of Clara. He lowered his great head until his nose was resting against her shoulder. And then, slowly, with the particular gravity of something very large choosing to make itself small, he folded his front legs and knelt in the frost-stiff grass before her. No one in the yard made a sound. Holt had gone very still. The footman was no longer pretending he had somewhere to be. The 2 grooms at the fence were not leaning anymore, they were standing straight, and one of them had taken his cap off without appearing to notice he had done it. At the back of the yard, half in the shadow of the doorway that led to the house, the Duke of Ashford stood with his hands clasped behind him. He had come down early that morning without telling anyone why. He did not move. He watched Clara place her hand on Erebus's neck, and he watched the horse close his eyes. The auction was cancelled the following day. No announcement was made. The estate manager simply sent a letter to the interested buyer explaining that the horse was no longer available, and that the Duke regretted any inconvenience. The buyer wrote back to say he was disappointed. The Duke did not reply. 3 days later, Clara was summoned to the study. She had never been inside it before. She stood near the door with her hands folded and her eyes moving carefully around the room, the shelves of books, the wide desk, the portrait above the fireplace of a woman she did not recognize. The Duke was standing at the window with his back to her when she entered. He turned when she closed the door. He asked her where she had learned to work with horses. She told him the truth. She had not learned. She had watched. She had watched Erebus from the first week he arrived, and she had seen that every person who came near him came with something they wanted: obedience, performance, submission, and that the horse had never, in his life, had anyone come near him with nothing to take at all. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her if she was afraid of the horse. She thought about this honestly. Then she said, "I was afraid of what would happen to him." That is not the same thing. The Duke looked at her for a long time. Then he said something she did not expect. He told her that he had a daughter who had died many years ago, when she was 11 years old. He said his daughter had loved horses in exactly the way Clara seemed to love them, not as beautiful objects, not as things to be shown off or mastered, but as individuals with their own interior lives, their own history, their own quiet language. He had not spoken of this daughter in years. He did not fully understand why he was speaking of her now. He offered Clara a position. Not a servant's position, a working position, with a proper salary, as assistant to the head groom, with specific and exclusive responsibility for Erebus. He asked her, formally, if she would accept. She said yes. She did not stammer once. Thomas Holt was informed that afternoon. He received the news with a tight jaw and said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, quietly, that he had no objection. Those who heard him say it were not sure whether to believe him. Over the following weeks, they came to believe him, not because he became warm toward Clara, but because he began watching her work with a particular, careful attention, the way a craftsman watches another craftsman do something he has not seen done before. The first morning Clara rode Erebus, it was December. The frost was heavier than it had been in weeks, and the paddock grass was white and stiff underfoot. She did not use a saddle. She stood beside him for a few minutes with her hand on his back, and then she climbed up, slowly, without drama, and sat. Erebus stood still. Then he began to walk. A slow circuit of the paddock, unhurried, his stride long and easy, as if this was something he had been doing for years and had simply been waiting for the right person to do it with. The Duke watched from his study window. Lady Seraphine watched from the garden wall. Thomas Holt watched from the stable door with his arms folded and his expression, for once, completely unguarded. None of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the scene was not already saying for itself. The letter arrived for Clara 2 weeks later. It was from a school in London, a girls' academy with a scholarship for students of exceptional ability, regardless of background. The letter had the Duke's name on it in the upper corner, as the person who had written on her behalf. He had described her, in the letter, as someone with a rare quality, the ability to understand living things not by controlling them, but by attending to them. Clara read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and held it in both hands for a long time. She thought about it for 3 days, the way she thought about most important things, slowly, without rushing herself, giving the question the same kind of patient attention she gave to everything that mattered. On the 4th day, she accepted. On the morning she left for London, she went to the stables before she went anywhere else. She spent an hour with Erebus, not talking, for once, just standing beside him with her hand on his neck and the familiar quiet settled between them like something that belonged there. When she finally turned to go, she did not look back. She had learned, from him, that looking back at something you are leaving does not help either of you. Erebus watched her go from the paddock gate. He stood still for a long time after the carriage disappeared down the lane, his ears forward, his dark eyes on the place where the road curved and became invisible. Thomas Holt found him there, an hour later, still standing at the gate. He stopped beside the horse and stood there awkwardly for a moment. Then, very slowly, he raised his hand and placed it on the animal's neck, not firmly, not with authority, but the way Clara had always done it, without asking for anything in return. Erebus did not move away. Holt stood there for a while longer than he intended. When he finally walked back to the stable, something in the set of his shoulders was different, a little less rigid, a little less certain that the only language worth speaking was the language of control. Clara did well at the school in London. She did not find it easy, but she had never expected anything worth having to be easy. She studied hard. She made one good friend, a girl from Yorkshire who also came from nothing and who found Clara's quietness restful rather than unsettling. She wrote letters home to her mother every week, and once a month she wrote a short letter to Lady Seraphine, who always wrote back. She did not write to Erebus, because she knew that was not the kind of language that worked between them. But sometimes, on quiet evenings in the school garden, she would sit on a low wall and look at the sky and talk in a low voice about whatever was in her mind, about a difficult lesson, about something that had made her laugh, about the color of the light at a particular moment, and she did not feel foolish doing it, because she knew, without needing to explain it to anyone, that some conversations do not require the other person to be in the room. What happened at Ashwood Manor that autumn was not a miracle, though some people described it that way afterward. It was something simpler and stranger than a miracle. It was one person paying attention, really paying attention, without any motive other than to understand, and finding that the thing she was attending to had been waiting a long time for exactly that. The horse had not been wicked. He had been waiting. And the girl that everyone had overlooked had simply been the first person willing to sit still long enough to find that out. End of story.